All right, we are live. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Lizzie. So good to see you. I know the last time we saw each other was in New York, actually, maybe just a month ago, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Shinji.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation that we had really sparked my interest to learn more deeply about data security and privacy because I found it so interesting how Telescope manages it and works with your customers. So, yeah, for the audience, let's start with an introduction. If you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this world of data security.
Of course. So I'm Lizzie. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Telescope. We're a data security and protection company. So we help people discover, classify, and protect their data automatically. The way I got into this was I joined Airbnb in 2017 as a generic software engineer, and we kind of got to pick teams as to what team we wanted to work on, and I chose data security. And since then, spent 5 years there building and leading their data classification kind of project, as well as other security and privacy initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, given a company like Airbnb, first of all, going through a massive growth in the industry, and also, it's not just like growing in the industry; it's a consumer company. So you have, by nature, you're gonna deal with a lot of sensitive data if you want to or not. And
Yeah,
then, uh, I'm sure it's a very tech driven company, even just, outside of security, a lot of data infrastructure and also data discovery, data usability perspective. Airbnb has contributed to so much to the industry and also shared a lot of that learnings. So I am, yeah, pretty surprised that, I am not surprised that security part was, the top notch, if not top notch in the industry. So I'm, yeah, curious to learn more today how you, I guess, got to this point of how currently securities are done, security management is done, and where you see the industry is heading.
for
So
sure.
maybe tell us a little bit more about Telescope, what you guys do in a nutshell.
So, yeah, we want to automate data protection in three ways, from detection to remediation to prevention. And so, the first thing that most companies need to take care of is figuring out where they're storing sensitive data, how secure that sensitive data is stored, who has access to that data. So, kind of more of a visibility around the security and privacy risks around their data. And that starts with figuring out where your sensitive data is stored. So, we can help companies do that automatically by scanning all of their data, no matter where it's stored, and classifying data and figuring out who has access to it, as well as surface their risks. Then the second part is, now what do we do with all of this information? Like, how do we remediate? What do we do to remediate it? And that's where Telescope can come in, whether that's providing companies with suggestions or redacting that data automatically for them, or fixing those misconfigurations. We can do that as well. And then finally, there's the preventative approach, which is we don't want sensitive data to ever be here in the first place. So, can you redact it as it's flowing? So, in the data pipelines, in logging libraries, in different types of places.
Cool. Well, that went deep very quickly.
Yeah,
Appreciate that.
I should have left it very
And
high
uh, so
level.
private data detection, remediation, and prevention. Do you see this all as a data security practice or like privacy practice? Like, to be honest, because in data and especially in the data security, it's actually very similar to data governance. There are a lot of terms, a lot of segments,
Same thing.
so it can get confusing to like normal people. I'm curious to understand and kind of like the management responsibility of different teams if the company has both data security and also data
Data
privacy
privacy.
teams.
So I think some of the core components are very similar, like you were saying, even with data governance teams, which is like classification, figuring out where you're storing sensitive data, and then doing something with that data. I think privacy comes at it from an approach of saying, okay, the user is the one that owns their data and they have rights to that data, and we need to comply with those rights. And with security, it's more of an approach of we need to secure that sensitive data from unauthorized access. And so those are kind of the different ways. Oh, I think we lost you, Shinji. One second, she'll be back.
Sorry about that.
Welcome
I
back.
hope I don't get cut off again. I'm pretty sure, and our operations manager is going to now yell at me to not getting a wired connection for it. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna be on this soon. Um, so yeah, I appreciate you breaking it down based on like access versus like the data management side. I think there's also like whenever somebody says like yeah privacy, like does this mean like I can just ask who can I have my data that you have collected so far, and can you delete my things like that. I don't know if I can. Okay.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I think you cut off one more time. So where would you say the teams overlap in terms of needs and priorities? That's a great question. I think it also depends from org to org. So for example, at Airbnb, the data security team was the one in charge of kind of like the overall data classification challenge. And at first, data security was also owning data subject rights request deletions as well as other security and privacy components. But then we split that off once we got a privacy team. So the core components of classification, understanding your data was owned centrally by security, but then the other teams owned, the privacy team owned taking action on behalf of privacy requests or enforcing privacy standards across the company.
Great. Thanks, Lizzie. So I guess my question leading up to that is, what do you see in the industry as Gen AI and AI is really coming into play? I feel like that the usage of Gen AI, you know, obviously has a lot of implication on the consumer end too, but in terms of how we work and a lot of the uh, productivity and efficiency perspective, it has been pretty meaningful for everyone in tech as well. And for data privacy and security, I do hear a lot about managing the workflow or PII detection to be all automated, so on and so forth. So I'm really curious to hear your thought on the effect and also what that would mean for managing privacy in general for the industry.
Yeah, so I think there's two components. One is using kind of Gen AI, like like public Gen AI, like for example, OpenAI, so publicly available models where you're sending data outside of your environment. And so for that, the main security concern and privacy concern is sending sensitive data. So that's where redaction comes in, making sure you're not sending that sensitive data to like an unwanted third party. And then there's actually building models in-house, and a lot of security concerns come from there, and majority of it is locking down that data that you're using for training, making sure there's no unauthorized access, so no data poisoning can come in and modify that data and make it output things that it shouldn't. Or making sure that there's another privacy concern of making sure that the data you're using for training is actually allowed to be used for this model's purpose. So let's say you have PII, like someone's first name, last name, and credit card number. You might not be able to use that information for advertising or marketing purposes. So knowing what data can be used for what is also really important as you're kind of building those models.
What about as a data team or as a security team trying to use Gen AI for my security and privacy management perspective? What's your thought on that? And how does Telescope work in regards to that?
So using AI internally for security perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we use AI internally. We don't use necessarily Gen AI because it doesn't scale well when you're scanning petabytes of data. We've built our own models to optimize kind of throughput as well as accuracy. But I do think teams can definitely make use of Gen AI if it's kind of helping their workflows, as long as they're just not sending sensitive or proprietary data to it.
So is it that if I want to do uh, PII detection, I should not use Gen AI because it's going to send all my private data
If you're,
to OpenAI
I
or
mean,
a
if you
service, which totally makes sense.
I mean, sometimes,
I agree.
sometimes if you're large enough and you can sign that contract with OpenAI where you can guarantee that they won't use your data for training, but you're still trusting them with keeping that data secure, and you're trusting another third party like you are for any third party.
Then is your recommendation perhaps using something like obviously Telescope is an option, but uh, if people want to run it themselves, like do you recommend also using things like open source models that I can host on my own? And
Definitely.
I'm curious what the accuracy and the quality of that is like.
So again, it's probably like the larger the model, the more accurate it's going to be, and the slower it's going to be. So it kind of
Mm,
depends on like your workflows and like what you're actually using this for. But yes, I would definitely say kind of host it yourself.
yeah.
It's not too hard nowadays to do that either.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
very good point. So earlier you mentioned about redacting your data before you sending it to OpenAI. So can you tell us a little bit more about the difference between redaction versus anonymization? Because
Yeah.
we could also mask, or I guess yeah, maybe the definition and yeah, how one should be used in one place versus not.
Yeah, so it depends again. So for example, there's different ways to anonymize the data and keep the use of the data intact. So for example, let's say you have data sets in Snowflake and you still want to be able to run analysis on it, but you don't want it to expose the personal and sensitive data. So you can encrypt it with different algorithms to make sure that the same token is anonymized in the same way. So for example, Shinji will get transformed in the same way. That way you can still run analysis on your data. But when we say about redaction, it's kind of removing the data completely, either replacing it with like a fake first name or replacing it with the word first name. So completely removing all use and removing all removing all probability of getting back to the original data.
Yeah, totally. That
Yeah.
makes sense. So if I'm completely obfuscating the data and like, if my ID is showing up on this table versus the other table is completely different, there's no way to join or track them out. So you consider that as redaction. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So if we do, I mean, different people will have different different ways of describing these words, but that's how I kind of differentiate them. Like with redaction is no way of getting back and no way of doing joining, but anonymization, while maintaining referential integrity, will help you do the joins and
Yeah.
run all those.
I feel like anonymization is also a very weird and a topic. And I say this because, after GDPR was introduced, companies like Google, after they got rid of ad ID.
Yeah,
Sales ID was that anonymized ID that I can use to retarget and follow the users around, because it's just a profile and there's a whole industry formed around this. And I would say even if the ad ID from Google is gone, and same with Apple, they got rid of it already. But even if it's gone, there is still a what they call it, DMP, data management platform market, where people have that model of this. It's this person, because like we have this cookie, that has these interests, maybe visited these sites, and coming from this IP address. So in a way, when you like push it down, you could detect
identify.
a person, and this is
Yeah,
why Google
exactly,
removed the ID. So like
exactly.
when companies treat anonymization, um, what do you? I know this is like a side question, but I'm just curious to hear your opinion. What do you think is the really like right way to have their data mart that people can just access without worrying about this privacy angle or compliance angle around uh, uh, PII access?
Yeah,
Because you know at the end of the day, having that anonymization as more of like, we have these many of unique users, and for me to be able to segment the users is also so important for companies to be aware of.
yeah,
And uh, uh but then you cannot just always operate on aggregated data.
yeah.
So
No, it's very true. And unfortunately, it's like a tricky question because let's say someone has like a very unique interest that maybe no one else in the world has, then even if it's kind of anonymized in some ways, you might still be able to kind of track that individual down. Similar to like zip codes. Sometimes if you have someone's zip code, that could mean, let's say, 10,000, 100,000 houses, or that could mean four houses. So it's kind of hard to give that sort of definition as to what is truly anonymized because sometimes, yeah, it might be indirectly, you might be able to indirectly identify the individual from there.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
actually, it reminds me of also this incident of, and I'm sure this, I'm sure Airbnb also has maybe similar type of system, but I worked at Facebook slash Meta like back in 2009, and even back then, and I know even still, like they have this very very strict system about guarding their data, especially when there is anything involved with user data. So they have their own way of anonymization, and any access that may happen, obviously you have no idea of like who's who, but like you as a data scientist or somebody who needs to do like um, more like a forensic investigation may need to require to use the understand user ID, but then they have like a very crazy monitoring system to do this auditing. And they do not ask you if you ever even by mistake stumbled upon looking up anybody by username, like you're just gonna get walked out the door by the HR, like literally.
that's great. So they were monitoring like access to those data stores, and if anyone accessed it, they would kind of notify you that it was.
Usually, yeah, usually because usually those data stores are not available for the general employees. They're very open about their data. They have one of the first modern data catalog that shows like the usage and all the related tables, lineage, all that type of stuff called data iData. But that's their data mart, and that's already cleansed already, but there's no such thing as anonymization because it's already aggregated.
Makes
But
sense.
for certain parts of the company, they may need to do this. And I feel like when you have that like quote unquote little bit more privileged access, they have this crazy monitoring to be able to basically get alert, somebody gets alerted, and you're not going to be at the company anymore after if you ever
That's
stumble
crazy.
upon it even by mistake. Yeah, so it's like I think that type of level of if you don't have that type of monitoring and alerting, like you just have to, in order for your company to continue be growing and have so many people, because like I think it's so important that way for anyone that deals with like very private data. So
100%.
um,
I really did something very similar too, where like data scientists didn't have access to PII. So basically, we'd classify the PII, and then if we find something that is considered PII, we'd route it to a database that requires privileged access. But if something wasn't sensitive at all, it could be publicly available for use. So pretty similar.
yeah, yeah, I think auditing and alerting on these access is something that more companies should adopt. Um, cool. So let's maybe go deeper into the detection, remediation, and prevention front. What are the ways that are currently being used to implement these steps? Where do you see that people are doing like are is like because if prevention was already done, maybe detection and remediation like it will be
It's not
much
needed.
less. But I feel like it's the other way around today. So
It is because people have already collected all the data that they're already storing. And sometimes you need to collect data and you need to make something maybe available to like engineers and data scientists. So you will always need detection and remediation, but prevention is good for things that you never need. Um, so from the detection part, I think there's a few different ways people go about it. A lot of people still do it pretty manually. They build their own data map manually by kind of either interviewing different teams that own the data sets or just manually reviewing the data as a central team and mapping and labeling the data that way. They might be using some sort of tools that AWS could provide, like Macy, to classify data, or they could use something like Telescope or other classification tools to automatically detect where sensitive data is stored across like cloud, third parties, on-prem, things like that.
yeah, I think one of the general like ways that a lot of companies now do this is through regex, right?
Yeah,
I think Macy supports regex. All the cloud providers like kind of like the brand like the V0 of all their privacy product starts with regex with the metadata, and then there is the scanning, sampling scanning part of the
exactly.
data. I think comes in for sure. Uh, okay. So now I have all my PIIs tags. Then what about remediation?
Yeah, so then you need to understand other things around that data. So are there security and privacy risks around it? Is it over openly accessible? Let's say you have a Google Drive file that stores SSNs and that's publicly shared or has a public link. Knowing things like that around the data can help you remediate it because now you know what your risks are and you have your policies and you can automate the remediation to match those policies to reduce your risk.
Ah, that's actually very interesting. So somehow in the past, I always thought remediation is actually more about like from the classification, looking at like which I guess regulatory aspect it falls in.
Yes,
But then remediation is actually more about because it falls into this group of rules, you need to do
this
X.
X, Y, and
But
Z.
it's not,
Exactly.
yeah. But I guess like there are two parts. One is, yes, there is the data, like what kind of data it is, right? Is it like name versus SSN, things like that? And then the other part is why and or where is this data is being used.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to how you see the difference in between these two. So just
Yeah.
as an example, there is a company that we've used in the past, and I actually was complaining to their engineer because they were, uh, by default, by connecting to the service, I felt like they were taking more information from the API than they really needed, and they've agreed that that is true. But then the partner's API does not allow them to do anything else. It's either you get the all
Whole
five
thing.
fields or
Yeah.
nothing. So they
Yeah.
have to get all five fields, and now they are worried. Well, I don't know, but we're not gonna really use that data, so we don't really want to hold on to that data either. But it
Yeah.
is keep getting piled up. So like I'm curious what you think because it's just the data. They're not doing anything about this four fields because they only need one. So
Yeah.
like in that case, like, what yeah do you do to remediate this?
That's a really good question. And I think there's two parts of those. One is the easy situation, not easy, but easier than the other one, where like a first name, you're collecting first name, last name, SSN, and you only want to use first and last name, and you never need to use SSN. Then I would suggest to kind of, let's say you're pulling it, then as you're processing it or after you've processed it, redact it and just never store it. Because once you store it, then you're at risk. Someone could end up seeing that this is available and start doing something with it without notifying the security or legal team. And this happens all the time. And then there's the other situation where you might be collecting first and last names from different places, and they can be used in different ways. Like one can be used to just provide your service, and the others could also be used for marketing. And so you need to track, like, when you're collecting, even if it's the same data type, like what is the purpose to process this data? Like, can I use it for marketing, or can I only use it to deliver my product? And so that's where data lineage would come to play, because once you know where the data came from, you can keep track of where it flows and keep propagating that tag, which is where I think data catalogs can really help.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we see a lot. First is because like as uh, a provider of data catalog, lineage, documentation, and entity relationship diagrams, it's really a lot of there's a lot of usage around lineage to understand, like, root cause analysis of why this dashboard is not loading. But also there's a lot of tracking around, so where did this data go to,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
how was this used? Uh, like like did this data get used as is, or was it aggregated, things like that. But the part that we usually focus on is what's the purpose of using this data. And like, I'm curious whether you see catalog as kind of like the place for people should document of the purpose, or yeah, I'm curious about like, what the practices are and the security side of the things.
Yeah, and again, I think this is more on the privacy spectrum of like purpose of processing some sort of data. I think that would fall on the privacy roadmap, and I think it's kind of having your source of truth of where like the data could come from, and then looking at the policies you have with different clients as to like where that data, like what you're allowed to do with that data, or with the consent of users and like what they've consented that data to be used for. And then once you know where that data came from, which is where the catalog could really help, then you can again propagate those tags across the different data streams as data sprawled through different environments.
Yeah, I think propagation of tags, especially from the source of the origin,
Yeah,
is so important.
so important.
Now I've seen, yeah, a number of companies like tagging their data at the event sourcing level on their Kafka topic, and once an event arrives, it gets tagged
Yeah,
right away, which I think is a, yeah, very good practice. Um,
and so I think that
I
that just brings mainly a question like, it seems I feel like data catalogs and data security and privacy tools can really work hand in hand. So I'm curious how you see, how you see kind of integrations between both.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of catalogs, and also our catalog has our own that metadata regex of like PII detection, and this is to ensure that the tags of data, even though a lot of the catalog is around supporting the data team and everybody else that's consuming the data. So usually, like, it's already put in like in the data mart that everyone's accessing. But I'm pretty sure is a vast amount of like other types of data that the security team has already organized and are not accessing. But so if I were to just zoom in into the data that everybody is using, analyzing, creating product on top of, so that data, one is that there are still can be sensitive data that you might need to classify. So I think that is like a one part where, because we are the main entry point for any employees to get access or understand what this data about, this having a good structure and tagging in the catalog, is that's why it's so important. And I think a lot of modern catalogs, including Select Star, where we do really well, is to manage them automatically. You
Yeah.
cannot possibly track manually how your data, what type of data needs to be protected or changed or anonymized uh, as because within the data lake, within the data warehouse, different teams are creating their own models and
Yeah.
analysis like every day. For the sourcing front, you can do it because somebody has to build a connector, and you usually bought a data, or you already usually have a certain contract in place that you can enforce, hence tag it there. But usually at the data lake, data warehouse level, it's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different teams are trying to use the data for their own purpose. And this is why this automatic tagging and having lineage is so important because
Yeah.
it's so painful to do this manually, and didn't just get out of hand so quickly. Um,
For sure.
so that's where I see a lot of this like security aspect is coming into data catalog and merged into the area of data governance. Because data governance is and should be really designed for people to be able to use the data correctly. And I believe that the main purpose of data governance, or the things that you do in data governance, is really organizing, putting a good guardrails in place so people are using the data, right data correctly.
In the right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so with that, I think yeah, so a lot of it is really around that annotation of the data. uh, but regarding privacy management perspective and security management perspective, I do see two other areas that we see as a pretty important use case. One is the audit part. So
Yeah.
we track the actual queries and views of tables, views, dashboards, reports. So all the way downstream, if a column that was marked as a PII has been queried and was a part of a result of a select query, then you can have a alerting to back to the admins so that they are aware that this has been happened either through a different application or on the existing SQL queries. I think that we have a customer that had built a reporting engine on this just through the API, which I thought was really cool.
Super cool.
Another big around security that always happens with lineage is also access control. So
Yeah.
when when I am trying to figure out whether I should give access to this table or dashboard, first, yes, you can look at if there are any annotation that has already happened. But in terms of dashboards or your gold tables or more reporting tables that may or may not contain the data, you can see the upstream lineage to see if there are any columns on the chain that has been used as is that is tagged as sensitive. And I think this is another part that we've seen customers building their own internal application so that not a human have to really approve or disapprove giving access to dashboards. It can be programmatically done by using the lineage and looking at the source data or by field of what is getting displayed within the reports and the views.
Awesome. No, that's really cool. Kind of data and engineering and security teams building tools on top of you, which is really cool to automate their manual processes.
Yeah, a lot of the times for us, we interface a lot more data teams, but I actually hope that I would like the part that I think the next level where we can go to is having the security teams to be also involved so that they can put their quote unquote business context, the security context on top of it. So they can also define not just like giving access or not, they can define the retention
Period.
or what
Yeah, it's
part
a big,
of the data should be displayed in what way. They
yeah,
can have or this user can see the data but not these columns or not these rows because of their not just role, but because these types of data adheres to these privacy policy and the regulations that you want to meet. And I think that's where the industry should head with so much of automation happening in this area.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just to automate a lot of the manual workflows they used to do. A lot of our customers are also building automations on top of us, similar to like instead of having a manual approval, knowing what type of sensitive data is there can help you make decisions as to whether or not to approve those requests.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like it's almost like you're building this like automated workflow, like which used to be more like a more simpler rules engine of it, this and that. And
Yeah.
now it's more of like a lot more like cases, coming from both the data classification as well as how that maps to the security policies, and then also the retention
Yeah.
and the purpose and the usage purpose, which I think is, I mean, it's the nerd of me talking, but it's just I feel like it's really cool once that gets implemented. So yeah, I'm curious, like, as a security engineer, what do you see as like a common misconception when companies implement data security and privacy management or automation in their company?
So a misconception of what people think we're doing in our day-to-day jobs.
Yeah, how they
Yeah,
do it, yeah, when
yeah,
they are trying to automate, because like, security teams, data teams, they don't want to do this like hand by hand, so they want to automate it.
yeah.
So but like in terms of like where they start and how they do it, I'm sure you've seen so many implementations, so yeah, I'm curious to like hear and also share with the audience like things that they should watch out for.
Yeah, there's many things. I think one thing that is true is unfortunately security, privacy ends up being a lot of manual work, which unfortunately is not super fun for like an engineer to do day to day. Whether that's sifting through what a tool is providing you as alerts, or whether you're doing the thing you're supposed to do manually, there is a lot of like manual work there, and that's kind of like the mission of Telescope, is to help alleviate that manual work. And then the second thing is, ideally in security and privacy, you'd have one tool that could kind of help you with all these different things. Let's say it's data classification, data redaction, data catalog. Like, ideally you'd have one tool that fits all, but unfortunately that's not the case. And a lot of times in security and privacy, you're just trying to stitch different tools together and make them communicate with one another to help achieve an end goal.
Yeah, I think in today's age, integration is so important,
Yeah,
and it becomes almost like a, yeah, I think a given thing, because I think we all know, or maybe, I mean, some people don't believe it, but it might be just my opinion. But I feel like there are a lot of tools that does really well in in certain regards, and don't necessarily have to encompass everything. When you are
exactly.
getting a like a very horizontally long tool, you're not gonna be happy with the quality of like a feature 1 and 2, and then you end up using only feature 3 and 4 while you're paying for everything. So I think
Exactly.
the being able to actually plug and play uh, uh, capabilities that it works really well, is a crucial part where integrations come in. And I think that as a tech industry in general, like we haven't done as a great job of providing like all the metadata and then a good exchange between the APIs. But I think it's really have been improving a lot over the last last 5 to 10 years. Like seriously, I
Definitely.
do see a lot of it that
Yeah,
has
and
happened.
now I feel
So
like, yeah, when people evaluate tools, another thing they evaluate is their integrations with other tools, right? Like, where can they propagate their information to, whether that's Datadog or Splunk or any other tool. And it
right.
is becoming more and more important and more improved. You're right. Like more tools have these native integrations now.
Yeah, and it's not just like, oh, can you like get this data? It's really about like how native the integrations are, which I
Mhm.
think is a worthwhile testing out.
Yeah. And I think what's cool too is people are exposing like APIs as well. So that even if that integration didn't exist, you still are able to take the data out and push it into a place that you need, whether that's third party or an internal tool that you've built, it's cool to see people expose like open APIs.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, I think the Telescope, you guys do this. Like we
Yeah,
basically everything that you see on Select Star on the UI, you can see it on the API. You can pull
API.
it from the API too, and that's like a huge uplift for teams.
Exactly.
Because data team is not just analysts and data engineers. Like there can be a lot of people on the engineering team or security team that wants to
Yeah,
leverage the data coming from the tool.
for sure.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome. So I guess regarding, like, let's say I want to like automate my security area. Like, what are the basic building blocks, or kind of like the foundational, um, not necessarily like tools, but in terms of processes that you would say that companies needs to have before they start evaluating the tools, because like this is just like a just getting things done, right? But in order
Yeah.
to, I think the other part that's very so important is that in order to get it done right, you need to have a really good purpose and the way that you want this to be like mapped out, so it can also be communicated to other parts of the organization. So what do you see that for data security and privacy perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And again, I feel like it's org by org, but I think the commonality is understanding what you need those tools to do based on the policies that you've implemented and those regulations that exist. So based on, you might have some idea of what type of data you're collecting in general, how your organization works, like is data kind of democratized with every engineer, or is it stored centrally in like one place where you're less afraid of that? I think it depends org by org, but I think you need to kind of have a mental map of like, this is the type of data I'm processing. These are the big picture risks I have, and this is how my organization works. And so this would be the best tool for me that fits kind of all of these criterias, because
Hmm.
orgs kind of operate differently. Like if your team is not like an engineering forward team, you might need a different tool than if your company is
Sure.
much more kind of developer forward and engineering forward.
And which team in organizations do you see in that segue, like defining and like the policies and
Yeah.
the data sets, for example? I guess the
So
data set level is going a little bit deeper, but at least the policies and things that we need to track in order to stay compliant. Is it all illegal or?
Yeah, I think it's legal a lot of the times. That starts the conversation, but I feel like they cannot answer a lot of the other questions, which is like, what data stores are we storing? How is data stored at this company? Like, how do engineers work with data? Which is why I think it's super important to have the data teams in the conversation, the security and privacy teams, and even like engineering platform teams, because they understand better than anyone how people interact with data and the different tools that exist in that company. So I
Yeah.
think it always starts with legal, but it's important to not just have legal in the conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we just finished. Well, I guess we are in the process of getting our, I would say, fourth SOC 2 report or
Step
SOC 2
two,
audit. Yeah, yeah.
nice.
SOC 2 type. So we're doing it as we do it every year since the very beginning of the company. And when we first started, it was a lot about defining those policies, and now the audit is all about how it's been implemented. When
Yeah,
when you look at the examples, has there been any exceptions? And I think it really gives a uh, good pulse on how our data and the way that the I guess data in general, like how we treat any of the data and information that we process in the company. So I really appreciate it. I mean, there's a lot of things that our team needs to go through and provide, but still it keeps us in check.
in check.
And I
Yeah,
feel like there needs to be more of that in the data side, just overall data usage side too, because GDPR, CCPA, like there are, yes, those are the regulations, but it's not like there's no quote unquote certification. There's no like real
Yeah,
true auditing until somebody like oh like
complaints. Yeah.
GDPR or I don't know the EU comes to you because you're a big company and they got a lot of complaints to decide to do an
It's
audit.
kind of
So
crazy.
I think
Like even like it's crazy. Like even HIPAA is self-certified. Like you don't have someone that comes in and audits you, which is crazy to think that that's still like for healthcare organizations. Like they don't have someone actually auditing that the policies are put in place, which is crazy. I don't know. Yeah.
in a way, I think it might also be because the data, like the auditors may need to look at that data, and that can be very sensitive. Like that's sometimes how I see SOC 2 as well, right?
Yeah.
Um, um, but also like having a standard organization to manage this and then have everybody to follow obviously is not a not an easy thing to go through.
Yeah.
But I agree. At least I think so. Like one of the things that we actually started doing since like 3 years ago is this um, like a HIPAA mapping. So on our section 5 of the report, like we have asked our auditors to put all the like SOC 2 regulations that is equivalent to HIPAA regulations.
Yeah.
So when there's no exception and when we sign a BAA with a
Mhm.
with a company regarding their data processing, we can give them our SOC 2 report that includes what it would mean for HIPAA. And
HIPAA makes
then
sense.
companies like Vanta and uh, I'm sure like other companies like Grata or other security management companies, they do have those automatic checks for both GDPR and HIPAA as well. So that's what we use to kind of keep ourselves in check.
Yeah.
But like it's yeah but I know that like still like it would be much more stronger if there is a more like somebody else also checking in on our implementation. And the implementation side I feel like is always kind of like because majority of the time having the policy is enough when there is no like a deeper auditing. So
Yeah,
just
and if you're a larger org, no one's gonna read that policy. Like honestly, like I don't think anyone reads like internal policies that get written by legal. Unfortunately, like first, like the language is also not easily understandable by like an engineer or like someone that isn't like familiar with legal terms. And two,
yeah
yeah, they just will never get to it. So having a tool that can kind of make sure that actually technically you're doing what you're saying you're supposed to be doing is really important. And it's also
and
cool
I think
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
No, you just finish your sentence.
Oh, all I was saying is like I think it's cool now that like SOC 2 is kind of useful to sell. Like and so now startups have to do SOC 2 earlier than ever before because it's required to actually sell, especially if you're like a B2B. And it's so much easier to do your SOC 2 type 2 versus 10 years from now when you have so much data and you never put any controls in place. So it's really cool that now it's coming on the earlier side.
Yeah, I actually think the best part about starting or having smaller companies like requiring SOC 2 is because it's actually easier to do it because you're building the system from scratch. So now everything gets on top of it. It just
Yeah,
follows that policy and the way that you implement. I mean, this is actually one of the reasons why I pushed for SOC 2 from very early on because I didn't want to go back and do it, like right.
it would
Um,
be much harder
but
to do that.
yeah, it is actually much harder
Yeah.
for larger companies to be compliant. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
uh,
Yeah.
Now I'm curious what your take is for the future, like with the AI, and I feel like there's also a lot of this like AI security, AI governance.
It's
Like
always like a
you've
new term.
mentioned about like where the data is going or like where it gets processed. Obviously AI, like it like when it's like such a like a black box, it's not gonna know or be able to tell you where the data has been gone or processed. um, there are so many different places where we can use the AI in the security front we have already talked about. If you think about, I guess less more or less the next 3 to 5 years, where do you think we are in terms of the security and privacy angle with Gen AI?
To protect Gen AI or to use Gen AI for security and privacy? Which one? The first
Both,
one?
both. I want to hear your
Both.
opinion on both.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first part is like to protect Gen AI, we're definitely still at the very beginning. People are mainly talking about redaction when it comes to Gen AI, but there's a lot more security and privacy concerns around the data pipeline, how the data goes from actual data source to training to output. And so I think there's still a lot more to do in that sense. But using
What
AI,
about side of security for AI, like where I don't want I want to prevent my AI to answer the questions and mistakenly giving out information that it's not supposed to.
supposed to.
Or yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on that, whether that's even like whether that's possible through just like evaluation frameworks and testing, or whether you think that the models will just kind of like you know learn the semantics better given the types of conversations it has.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of components, right? Like I think the model could output, let's say, an answer to one person, but maybe shouldn't output the same answer to the others based on, again, access control. So now we're even going to see access control with AI inputs and outputs. So I think there's a lot that's going to come, like to evaluate the output and like figuring out who should be able to see this information and or if it should just never be seen. And then there's also security of like the inputs and the training and making sure that's kind of locked down. So I definitely see it as both approaches, like the training and then the outputs and evaluating what the model is actually spitting out, whether that's a security concern or if it's like hallucinations and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about using AI for security and
Security and
privacy?
privacy. Yeah.
Like do you think that having a like a security and privacy, like do we still have to do this if Gen AI or AI is going to do this for us
I think
in the
again,
future?
I think it's like picking the right tool for the right purpose, right? So, for example, at Telescope, we can't use Gen AI models. Like that will just take way too much time to process and scan petabytes of data, and be able to output like meaningful results in a meaningful amount of time. Um, but for example, like if you just want to summarize the findings and use Gen AI to kind of output a summary, I think that's great. I think it's just finding the right tool for the right approach.
Mhm.
And I think we still have a lot of limitations with AI. So I still think a human is definitely needed as part of the loop.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
aside questions on this, because you mentioned about scanning, and I am completely with you. Using Gen AI for this doesn't make sense. It's gonna take too long. It's too heavy, and this is like I think one of the pitfalls of like older generation legacy data. Sensitive data detection companies that had end up falling into, because whenever they go into these enterprises, it takes forever and it takes so much compute to get
Exactly.
this going, right? So like what is your like, but still like you still have to scan the data if you want to like pick out like uh, from all the data that you have. So like what is your thought on um, doing metadata only or
Yeah.
regex, like pattern matching, versus sampling data and how much to sample, or if there's a
Yeah.
different sampling technique that you feel like is important,
Yeah.
versus like when, like in what cases do you really have to scan all the
Everything.
rows
Yeah,
for
that's a good point.
data dissection?
So, okay, that's a really good point. I think metadata only can get you, let's say, 50% of the way there, or like regex as well. But unfortunately, like it will
Uh,
come with like false positives and false negatives. And so that's a big problem. And that's where like it becomes really important to scan the data itself. And so for us, we took a different approach. We've built our own models kind of from scratch to scan different types of data. So instead of like one model fits all, we have a model that's trained on columnar data. We have a model that's trained on like natural language data. So we've built a model that processes different types of data to maximize accuracy but also throughput. But sampling is definitely necessary. I think if you're scanning especially structured data where you could assume that most of it is the same, especially if you scanned a sample and like 90% of that sample is a first name, you don't need to scan the rest of the rows to determine that it's a first name as well.
Got it. So I guess like just to like reinterpret. So if I have structured data, I can probably be able to get by with sampling. If I
Yes.
have just to get it as like a quick and dirty, I could do with regex, and then somebody in my team to just monitor or double check if there are anything that may come through. I guess both the
Depends on
metadata
the
and
scale
like
and the
light
data.
sampling.
Yeah. And depends on the
Yeah,
scale,
I think
right? If you have 3,000 tables, maybe that's possible, but if you have 100,000 tables, then that's where like the regex component doesn't work that well because that human in the loop requires a lot of effort for like 100,000 tables versus a few thousand.
right.
Yeah.
So that's where the sampling is probably going to be like a really good augmentation when I have 100,000 tables. But still, structured data, I think those first two really would work well. And when you say you're sampling, how much do you guys sample? Like, is there an optimal amount of number of sample based on like, I don't know, is it like 5% of the total number of rows or yeah?
I think it depends, right? Like if you just want a quick and dirty breadth first search and then wait for the next samples to come on, if you're running this on a continuous basis, I
Mm,
would say even like 500 rows is enough to give you a really good idea of like what's out there and will run much faster than if you're scanning, let's say 50% of those rows, as well as like in cost, right? If you're scanning
yeah.
Snowflake, that's going to cost you a lot more to scan all the rows versus just a few.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when do you recommend actually scanning all the rows? Is it mostly when it's an unstructured data? But
Yeah.
even for like, let's say if I have like a Parquet format or like some different format, like, there are, different ways to query it. So yeah, I guess when is it necessary to
Yeah.
scan all the rows?
It could even be in structured data. Let's say you know that like you've detected, let's say you want to do redaction, not just classification, and like there's a password that got leaked
Hmm.
to this column, then you need to scan all the rows and redact those passwords that got leaked by
Right.
accident into this table. So I think there's that. When it's more, it
But
could even be unstructured data in a structured data store, right? Like you could have like a not JSON, but it could be like a free
But
form
but I
input.
don't need detection if I know that this like wasn't imposed. I can just do the redaction right away, right? Like the
Yeah. If you know it was there,
the
or if
scanning.
yeah, let's say you scanned and then you found one, then you're like, okay, this should never be there. We need to now scan the entire rows to see how
Yeah,
big.
but I
Yeah.
guess if an unstructured data is exposed, then you need both detection and redaction. So,
Yeah, and sometimes there's unstructured data in a table, right? Like there could be a free form input that users kind of write in, and that could contain literally anything. So that's where you probably need to sample a bit more than others.
yeah, totally makes sense. Um, that's really helpful. I realize that we have 1 minute
I
left. I don't know
know.
if there are any more questions, but this went so quickly. So thanks so much for joining me today, Lizzie.
Thank you so much.
I had so much fun.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Shinji.
Awesome. Well, thanks
Mm.
everyone for joining. Check out Telescope, and yeah, I'm really excited that I think in the future there will be a lot more integration between us and also just overall data security and governance fronts. So thanks,
Awesome.
Lizzie, again.
Thank you so much.
Have a good
Thanks,
weekend.
everyone.
See
You
you
too.
later. Bye.
Bye. Bye.